The fluorescent lights in the unemployment office buzzed with the kind of persistence that made your teeth ache, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that seemed designed to drain hope from whoever sat beneath them. Marcus Williams adjusted the threadbare collar of his thrift store jacket, feeling the rough polyester scratch against his neck as he shifted in the plastic chair that had seen better decades. Around him, dozens of people waited with the particular stillness of those who had learned that sudden movements attracted unwanted attention from overworked bureaucrats. The air smelled of industrial disinfectant and desperation, a combination that Marcus had never experienced from this side of the equation. If you've ever wondered what the world looks like when you strip away everything that defines you in society's eyes, stay with me, because what this man discovered will challenge everything you think you know about poverty, privilege, and the invisible barriers that separate us. 3 months earlier, Marcus had been sitting in a corner office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower, reviewing quarterly reports that showed his tech company's valuation had just crossed the $100 million mark. The view from his window encompassed half the city, a sprawling landscape of possibility that he had conquered through a combination of brilliance, timing, and the kind of relentless work ethic that his grandmother had instilled in him during those childhood summers in rural Alabama. But success, he had learned, could be its own kind of prison, surrounding you with people who saw only your net worth, who measured every interaction against what you could do for them. The idea that would change everything had come to him during a board meeting, watching his fellow executives discuss a proposed community outreach program with the detached enthusiasm of people planning a charity auction. They spoke about the disadvantaged and underserved populations, with the clinical precision of scientists studying specimens, never once acknowledging that they were talking about human beings whose struggles they could not begin to comprehend. "And we need to understand our target demographic better," his marketing director had said, clicking through slides filled with statistics and demographic breakdowns. "The data shows significant market penetration opportunities in lower-income communities, but our messaging isn't resonating. We're not connecting with their lived experience." The phrase had stuck in Marcus's mind like a splinter, lived experience, as if poverty were a lifestyle choice, a cultural preference that could be decoded and exploited for profit. That night, alone in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city lights, Marcus had made a decision that his lawyers would later call insane and his accountant would describe as financial suicide. He was going to disappear into the world his company claimed to want to serve, not as Marcus Williams, the millionaire entrepreneur, but as Mark Johnson, a recently laid-off warehouse worker with a high school education and $43 in his checking account. The transformation had taken weeks of careful planning. Marcus had studied method acting techniques, practiced altering his speech patterns, learned to carry himself differently, to make himself smaller in spaces where confidence was seen as arrogance or threat. He had researched the bureaucratic maze that people without resources had to navigate, the forms and waiting lists and requirements that seemed designed to exhaust applicants before they could access help. Most importantly, he had created an entirely new identity, complete with employment history, references, and a backstory that would hold up under casual scrutiny. Mark Johnson had worked for 15 years at a series of blue-collar jobs, had never owned property, had no college education, and possessed none of the social connections that opened doors in the professional world. On paper, Mark was invisible, just another statistic in the growing ranks of the economically displaced. Now sitting in the unemployment office with a number clutched in his sweating palm, Marcus was beginning to understand the difference between knowing about poverty and living it. The woman behind the bulletproof glass had looked at his paperwork with the weary expression of someone who had seen the same story 1,000 times, her fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical efficiency as she entered his information into a system that would determine whether he qualified for benefits that might, if he was lucky, cover his rent for a few months. The questions had been invasive and humiliating, designed to catch fraud, but delivered with an assumption of guilt that made him feel like a criminal for needing help. When she had finally handed him a folder of forms to complete and told him to take a seat, her tone had carried the clear message that his time was worth nothing, that he should be grateful for whatever scraps the system chose to throw his way. Mark Johnson. The caseworker's voice cut through the ambient misery of the waiting room, and Marcus stood, following her gesture toward a cubicle that offered the illusion of privacy while remaining completely exposed to anyone who cared to listen. The woman, whose nameplate identified her as Sandra Martinez, looked to be in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she had started this job with good intentions and watched them slowly erode under the weight of an impossible caseload and insufficient resources. She gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her desk, which was covered with stacks of files and a coffee mug that proclaimed, "World's okayest mom," in fading letters. "So, Mr. Johnson, I see you were laid off from Consolidated Logistics 3 weeks ago. 15 years with the company. That's rough. What kind of work are you looking for?" Sandra's voice was professional but not unkind, and Marcus could see that she was trying to maintain some measure of human dignity in a process designed to strip it away. Anything, really. Warehouse work, shipping, maybe something in retail. I'm not picky. Marcus had practiced this response, making sure his voice carried the right note of desperate humility without sounding rehearsed. He watched Sandra's fingers move across her keyboard, entering his responses into fields that would categorize him, sort him, determine his worth in the eyes of the system. Education level. High school diploma. Graduated from Lincoln High in 1998. The lie came easily now, backed by weeks of research into the school's history, the names of teachers who had long since retired, the details that would make his fabricated past seem real. Any special skills? Certifications? Computer experience? Sandra's questions were routine, part of a script she had probably recited thousands of times, but Marcus could hear something else in her voice, a note of hope that maybe this time would be different, that maybe she could help someone find a way out instead of just processing them through the system. I can use basic computer programs, Word, Excel, that kind of thing, learned it on the job. Marcus had deliberately kept his fictional skills modest, knowing that claiming too much expertise would raise questions about why someone with his abilities was sitting in an unemployment office. Sandra nodded, making notes in his file. The job market is tough right now, especially for people without college degrees. But there are some programs that might help. Skills training, job placement assistance. The waiting lists are long, but if you're serious about finding work. She trailed off, and Marcus could see her calculating whether it was worth investing time in someone who might disappear like so many others, worn down by a system that seemed designed to discourage rather than assist. I'm serious, Marcus said, and for the first time since beginning this experiment, he meant it completely. I need to work. I've got rent due, bills to pay. I can't afford to be picky. Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Sandra's expression softened slightly. Okay. I'm going to put you in the system for job placement services and sign you up for the skills assessment program. It's a 6-week course that covers basic office skills, customer service, things like that. Doesn't pay much, but it's something, and it might lead to better opportunities. She handed him another stack of forms. Fill these out and bring them back next week. And Mr. Johnson, don't give up. I know it feels hopeless right now, but people do find their way out of this. Marcus took the forms, feeling their weight in his hands like a physical reminder of how many hoops people had to jump through just to survive. Thank you. I really appreciate your help. The gratitude in his voice was genuine, even if the circumstances were not. Sandra Martinez was doing her best in an impossible situation, trying to maintain humanity in a system that seemed designed to crush it. Walking out of the unemployment office into the grey afternoon, Marcus felt the weight of what he had just experienced settling over him like a heavy coat. The humiliation, the assumption of failure, the way the system treated people as problems to be managed rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. He had known, intellectually, that poverty was difficult. He had read the statistics, funded the studies, written the checks to charities that promised to address the root causes. But knowing and experiencing were two different things entirely, separated by a chasm that no amount of money or good intentions could bridge. His next stop was the housing office, where he hoped to find information about low-income housing options. The building was a monument to bureaucratic indifference, all concrete and fluorescent lights and signs that seemed designed to confuse rather than inform. The waiting room was packed with families carrying manila folders and worn expressions, children fidgeting in chairs too big for them, while their parents stared at numbers on a digital display that moved with glacial slowness. Marcus took his number and found a seat next to a young woman who was trying to keep her toddler entertained with a coloring book that had seen better days. "First time here?" she asked, noticing his confusion as he tried to decipher the various signs and directions posted on the walls. "Yeah, just lost my job, trying to figure out my options." Marcus was surprised by how easily the lie came now, how naturally he had slipped into the role of someone society had written off. "I'm sorry, that's rough." The woman's sympathy was genuine, offered without judgment or pity. "I'm Lisa. This is my daughter, Emma. We've been on the waiting list for affordable housing for 8 months now. They keep saying maybe next month, maybe the month after that. In the meantime, we're staying with my sister, all of us crammed into her 1-bedroom apartment." Marcus looked at Emma, who couldn't have been more than 3, coloring carefully within the lines of a picture of a house with a white picket fence. "Well, 8 months. That's a long time to wait." "That's nothing. I know people who've been waiting 2 years, 3 years. The list is so long, they stopped taking new applications last year. They say they might open it up again in the spring. But who knows?" Lisa's voice carried the weary acceptance of someone who had learned not to hope too hard for things beyond her control. "But what do you do in the meantime?" "You survive. You take whatever work you can find. You rely on family and friends. You pray nothing goes wrong because you're already hanging by a thread." She paused, watching her daughter color. "Before Emma was born, I had a good job, benefits, my own place. Then I got pregnant, and the father disappeared, and I had to take time off for the birth, and by the time I was ready to go back to work, they'd replaced me. It's amazing how fast your whole life can change. Marcus felt something twist in his chest, a recognition of how precarious security really was for most people. How a single setback could send someone tumbling down a slope that got steeper with every step. I'm sorry, that shouldn't happen. No, it shouldn't, but it does every day. The system isn't designed for people like us. It's designed for people who already have everything they need. Lisa's observation was delivered without bitterness, just the matter-of-fact assessment of someone who had learned to see the world clearly. When Marcus's number was finally called, 3 hours later, he found himself across from another overworked caseworker who explained that the waiting list for subsidized housing was currently closed, that emergency assistance was limited to families with children, and that his best option was probably to look for a room in a boarding house or shared housing situation. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, and Marcus left with a photocopied list of resources that looked like it had been copied so many times the text was barely legible. That evening, Marcus sat in the studio apartment he had rented in a neighborhood he had never visited during his previous life, eating a dinner of canned soup and crackers while reviewing the forms Sandra Martinez had given him. The apartment was a far cry from his penthouse, with thin walls that carried every sound from the neighboring units and a radiator that clanged like a ghost in chains. But it was clean and safe, and the landlord had been willing to accept a cash deposit and the first month's rent without running a credit check, which had been crucial since Mark Johnson's credit history was as fictional as everything else about him. The skills assessment program Sandra had mentioned was scheduled to begin the following Monday. 6 weeks of basic training that might lead to a minimum wage job if he was lucky. Marcus had initially planned to document the experience and then return to his real life, armed with insights that would help his company develop better products and services for underserved communities. But something was happening that he hadn't anticipated. The people he was meeting, the struggles he was witnessing, the daily humiliations and small victories that made up life on the economic margins were changing him in ways he couldn't have predicted. The program was held in a community center that smelled of industrial carpet and hope, taught by a woman named Patricia Williams, who had the kind of energy that suggested she genuinely believed in what she was doing. The other students were a mix of ages and backgrounds, united only by their shared need for the skills that might help them climb out of whatever hole they had fallen into. There was James, a veteran in his 50s, who had been struggling with PTSD and unemployment since returning from his 3rd deployment. Maria, a single mother who spoke English as a second language and was trying to transition from cleaning offices to working in them. Robert, a man in his 40s who had been laid off from a factory job and was trying to learn computer skills that hadn't existed when he started working 20 years earlier. The most important thing to remember, Patricia said during the first class, is that you all have value. You have skills, experience, perspectives that employers need. Our job here isn't to change who you are. It's to help you communicate your worth in a language the business world understands. Her words were meant to be encouraging, but Marcus could see the skepticism in some of his classmates' faces, the wariness of people who had been told they were valuable while being treated as disposable. The curriculum covered basic computer skills, professional communication, interview techniques, and workplace etiquette. For Marcus, most of the material was elementary, concepts he had mastered decades earlier. But he watched his classmates struggle with tasks he took for granted, saw the frustration in Maria's eyes when the computer froze, the shame in Robert's face when he had to ask for help with email, the way James's hands shook when he had to practice making small talk with potential employers. These weren't lazy people or stupid people. They were people who had been left behind by an economy that changed faster than they could adapt, people whose skills had become obsolete, people who had never had the luxury of learning things that others took for granted. During the lunch break on the 3rd day, Marcus found himself sitting with James, who was picking at a sandwich that looked like it had come from a gas station. "Adi, you seem different from the others," James said without preamble. "You talk like you've been around educated people before." Marcus felt his heart rate spike, wondering if his cover was blown. "I read a lot. Always have. My grandmother used to say education was the one thing nobody could take away from you." James nodded slowly. "Smart woman." "Mine used to say something similar. Knowledge is power, but only if you know how to use it. I had knowledge once, knew how to fix anything with an engine, could diagnose problems just by listening, but everything's computerized now, and I can't afford the training to keep up. So here I am, 53 years old, learning how to send an email." "It's not too late," Marcus said, and meant it. "You've got experience, wisdom. That counts for something." "Does it?" James's question was genuine, not rhetorical, because I've been to a lot of interviews in the past 2 years, and every time they see my age, my gaps in employment, the fact that I don't have a college degree, and I can see them writing me off before I even sit down. They ask about my computer skills, my social media presence, my familiarity with the latest software, and I might as well be speaking a foreign language. Marcus wanted to tell him that age discrimination was illegal, that employers were required to give fair consideration to all applicants, that there were protections in place. But he was learning that the law and reality were often two different things, that discrimination could be subtle and systemic, hidden behind legitimate-sounding reasons that were impossible to challenge. Instead, he said, maybe we need to find employers who value experience over youth, who understand that some things can't be taught. Maybe, James said, but his tone suggested he had stopped believing in maybes a long time ago. That afternoon, Patricia announced that they would be doing mock interviews, practicing the skills they had learned with volunteers from the local business community. Marcus felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, not because he was afraid of the interview, but because he was afraid of being recognized. The volunteers were successful professionals, the kind of people who might have attended the same conferences or charity events as Marcus Williams. But when the volunteers arrived, he realized his fears were unfounded. These weren't CEOs or venture capitalists. They were middle managers and small business owners, people who had achieved modest success and were giving back to their community in small but meaningful ways. Marcus's interviewer was a woman named Carol Henderson, who managed a local insurance office. She was perhaps 45, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she had worked her way up from the bottom. The mock interview went smoothly, with Marcus deliberately making small mistakes to avoid standing out, but Carol seemed impressed with his responses. "You interview well," she said when they finished. "You're articulate, professional. You make good eye contact. Have you considered sales, insurance, real estate, something like that? You've got the communication skills for it." "I hadn't really thought about it," Marcus replied. "I've always done more physical work, warehouse, shipping, that kind of thing." "Well, maybe it's time to think about a change. The insurance industry is always looking for good people, and a lot of the skills transfer. You understand hard work. You know how to deal with people. You're reliable. Those are the things that really matter." Carol handed him her business card. "If you're interested, give me a call. We've got an entry-level position opening up next month. It's not glamorous, and the pay starts low, but there's room for advancement if you're willing to work for it." Marcus took the card, feeling the weight of the opportunity she was offering. Not to Mark Johnson, the fictional character he was playing, but to a real person who needed a chance. "Thank you. I really appreciate this." "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're successful," Carol smiled. "And Mr. Johnson, don't sell yourself short. You've got more potential than you realize." Walking home that evening, Marcus found himself thinking about Carol's words, about the gap between potential and opportunity, about how many talented people were trapped in cycles of poverty, not because they lacked ability, but because they lacked access to the networks and resources that turned ability into success. He thought about James, whose mechanical expertise was being rendered obsolete by technology he couldn't afford to learn. He thought about Maria, whose intelligence and work ethic were hidden behind a language barrier that employers used as an excuse to dismiss her. He thought about all the people he had met in the past few weeks, people whose stories would never be told because they didn't fit the narrative of individual responsibility and bootstrap success that society preferred to believe. That night, Marcus made a decision that would have shocked his board of directors and terrified his accountants. He was going to take Carol's job offer, not as a temporary experiment or a research project, but as a genuine attempt to build a life as Mark Johnson, to see how far he could climb starting from the bottom with nothing but the skills and determination that millions of people brought to the same challenge every day. He would keep his real identity hidden, continue living in the studio apartment, continue navigating the bureaucratic maze that defined life for the working poor. But he would also use every lesson he learned, every connection he made, every insight he gained to understand how the system really worked from the inside. The insurance office where Carol worked was located in a strip mall between a nail salon and a Chinese restaurant, the kind of unglamorous space that housed much of America's small business economy. Marcus arrived for his first day wearing a suit he had bought at a discount store, the fabric slightly rough and the cut imperfect as but clean and professional enough to meet the dress code. Carol introduced him to the rest of the staff, a mix of long-time employees and recent hires who were all trying to make their numbers in an industry that rewarded persistence over brilliance. His training began with learning the computer systems, software that was functional but outdated, clearly chosen for cost rather than efficiency. Marcus found himself genuinely struggling with some aspects of the work, not because it was intellectually challenging, but because the tools were so different from what he was used to. The database was slow and clunky, the forms were confusing, and the whole process seemed designed to create obstacles rather than facilitate solutions. He began to understand why customer service was so often frustrating for both employees and clients, why simple transactions took longer than they should, why people on both sides of the counter often seemed irritated by the end of an interaction. His supervisor was a man named Dave Kowalski, who had been with the company for 12 years and had the weary competence of someone who had learned to work within a flawed system rather than fight it. Dave was patient with Marcus's questions, explaining not just what to do, but why the procedures existed, sharing the kind of institutional knowledge that never made it into training manuals. The thing you have to understand, Dave said during Marcus's second week, is that insurance is really about trust. People are paying us money for something they hope they'll never need, and when they do need it, they're usually having the worst day of their lives. Our job isn't just to process claims or sell policies. It's to be the calm voice in the storm, the person who makes a bad situation a little bit better. Marcus found himself genuinely engaged by the work in ways he hadn't expected. Each client had a story, a set of circumstances that had brought them to his desk seeking protection against an uncertain future. There was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who needed to update her homeowner's policy after her husband's death, navigating grief and bureaucracy simultaneously. There was Tommy Rodriguez, a young father buying his first life insurance policy, trying to balance the cost against his family's security. There was Sarah Mitchell, a small business owner whose shop had been vandalized, filing a claim that would determine whether she could afford to rebuild or would have to close permanently. These weren't abstract demographics or market segments. They were human beings with real problems, real fears, real hopes for the future. And Marcus was learning that the difference between good customer service and bad customer service often came down to whether the person behind the desk saw clients as people or as transactions, whether they were willing to spend an extra few minutes explaining options or finding solutions that the computer system didn't automatically suggest. 3 weeks into the job, Marcus encountered a situation that would test everything he had learned about the gap between policy and practice. A client named Angela Washington came in to file a claim after a kitchen fire had damaged her apartment. She was a single mother working 2 jobs, and the fire had destroyed not just her belongings, but her sense of security. The claim should have been straightforward, but when Marcus reviewed her file, he discovered a problem. Her premium payments had been late several times over the past year, and according to company policy, late payments could be grounds for claim denial, especially if there was a pattern of delinquency. Marcus looked at Angela's payment history more closely and saw the story it told. The late payments coincided with gaps in her employment, periods when she had been between jobs or dealing with her daughter's medical issues. She had always caught up eventually, sometimes paying double to make up for missed payments. But the pattern was there in black and white, a paper trail of financial instability that the company could use to avoid paying her claim. "Is there a problem?" Angela asked, noticing his hesitation as he reviewed her file. Marcus looked at her across the desk, seeing the worry in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she waited for his response. He thought about the company's profit margins, about the bonuses that executives received for keeping claim payouts low, about the shareholders who would never know Angela's name or story. Then he thought about Dave's words, about trust, about being the calm voice in the storm, about making bad situations a little bit better. Let me check something," Marcus said, turning back to his computer. He spent the next 20 minutes reviewing Angela's file, looking for any technicality or exception that might allow the claim to be approved despite the late payment history. Finally, he found what he was looking for. The company's policy manual included a provision for good faith efforts to maintain coverage, which could be applied in cases where customers had demonstrated intent to keep their policies current, despite temporary financial difficulties. "Good news," Marcus said, looking up at Angela with a smile. "Your claim is approved. The check should be processed within 5 business days." Angela's relief was visible, her shoulders sagging as the tension left her body. "Thank you. I was so worried. I know I've been late with payments sometimes, but I always catch up. I can't afford to lose my coverage. I understand. Life happens. The important thing is that you kept trying, and that counts for something." Marcus handed her the paperwork, watching as she signed with hands that were no longer shaking. After Angela left, Marcus sat at his desk thinking about what had just happened. He had bent the rules, interpreted policy in the most favorable way possible for the client, and in doing so, he had probably cost the company several $1,000s. In his previous life, he might have seen this as poor business practice, a failure to maintain proper controls over claim expenses. But from this side of the desk, it felt like the right thing to do, the human thing to do. Dave appeared at his cubicle a few minutes later, holding Angela's file. "I saw you approved the Washington claim. That was a judgment call. Want to walk me through your reasoning?" Marcus felt his heart rate spike, wondering if he had made a mistake that would cost him his job. "She's been a customer for 6 years. The late payments were always followed by catch-up payments. She's demonstrated good faith effort to maintain coverage. I thought the circumstances warranted approval under the good faith provision." Dave nodded slowly, reading through the file. "It's a reasonable interpretation. The Home Office might have denied it, but you're not wrong. And sometimes doing the right thing is more important than following the letter of the law." He handed the file back to Marcus. "Good work. That woman has been through enough without us adding to her problems." That evening, Marcus walked home through neighborhoods he was beginning to know intimately, past the corner store where he bought his groceries, past the laundromat where he had learned to make small talk with strangers while waiting for his clothes to dry, past the bus stop where he had overheard countless conversations about the daily struggles of people trying to make ends meet. He was no longer an observer in this world. He had become a participant, someone whose decisions affected real people in real ways. His phone buzzed with a text from his real assistant, reminding him about a board meeting scheduled for the following week. For a moment, Marcus felt the pull of his other life, the world of corporate jets and five-star restaurants and decisions that moved millions of dollars with a signature. But that world felt increasingly distant, like a movie he had watched long ago, vivid but not quite real. Instead, he thought about Angela Washington, about the relief in her eyes when he told her the claim was approved. He thought about James from the skills training program, who had called that afternoon to say he had gotten a job at an auto parts store, not fixing engines, but helping customers find the right parts, using his knowledge in a new way. He thought about Maria, who had been hired as a bilingual customer service representative, her language skills finally seen as an asset rather than a barrier. These were small victories, individual success stories that wouldn't make headlines or change systemic problems. But they mattered to the people involved, and Marcus was beginning to understand that real change happened one person at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of choosing to see someone's humanity rather than their circumstances. The revelation that would change everything came on a Thursday morning in October, when Marcus was reviewing insurance applications and came across a name that made his blood run cold. The application was for a small business policy, and the business name was Meridian Community Development, a subsidiary of his own company that he had created to handle the corporation's charitable initiatives. The contact person listed was Jennifer Hayes, his own director of corporate social responsibility, and the address was for a community center in the same neighborhood where he was now living and working. Marcus stared at the application, his mind racing through the implications. His own company was operating in this community, implementing programs that were supposed to help people exactly like the ones he had been meeting over the past few months. But he had never seen any evidence of Meridian Community Development's work, never encountered anyone who had been helped by the programs he had funded. The community center listed on the application was just 3 blocks from his apartment, but when he had walked past it, it had always appeared closed, with no signs of activity or programming. That afternoon, Marcus took his lunch break and walked to the community center. The building was a converted warehouse with large windows and a fresh coat of paint, but the parking lot was empty and the doors were locked. A small sign by the entrance listed the hours of operation as Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, but it was clearly Thursday at 1 in the afternoon, and there was no one around. Marcus walked around the building, peering through windows, and saw what appeared to be a large, empty space with a few tables and chairs scattered around, but no evidence of ongoing programs or services. Confused and increasingly concerned, Marcus returned to the office and used his computer to research Meridian Community Development's activities. What he found made his stomach turn. According to the company's website and tax filings, Meridian was operating multiple programs in the community, providing job training, financial literacy classes, and small business development services. The budget for these programs was substantial, funded by grants from his own foundation, as well as government contracts and other charitable donations. On paper, Meridian was helping hundreds of people every year, providing exactly the kind of services that Marcus had seen were desperately needed. But Marcus had been living in this community for months, had attended the only job training program available, had visited every social service office and community organization, and he had never encountered anyone who had been helped by Meridian Community Development. The program that had actually helped him and his classmates was run by Patricia Williams out of a different community center, operating on a shoestring budget with donated supplies and volunteer instructors. That evening, Marcus sat in his studio apartment, staring at his laptop screen as he dug deeper into Meridian's operations. What he discovered was a sophisticated shell game, a network of contracts and subcontracts that moved money around without delivering actual services. The community center was real, the staff was real, the programs existed on paper, but the actual work was either minimal or non-existent. Most of the budget was going to administrative costs, consultant fees, and overhead expenses that seemed designed to enrich the people running the programs rather than help the people they were supposed to serve. The worst part was that Marcus recognized the model. It was a common practice in the non-profit world, organizations that existed primarily to generate revenue for their operators, while providing just enough actual service to maintain their charitable status and keep the grants flowing. He had seen it before, had even unknowingly funded similar operations, but he had always assumed that proper oversight and accountability measures would prevent the worst abuses. Now he was seeing how easy it was to game the system, how organizations could appear successful on paper while failing completely in practice. Marcus spent the next several days investigating further, using his access to the insurance company's database to research other businesses and organizations in the area. What he found was a pattern of non-profit organizations that claimed to be serving the community but seemed to exist primarily to enrich their operators. Meanwhile, the organizations that were actually doing the work, like Patricia's job training program and the food bank where he had volunteered, were struggling with inadequate funding and constant uncertainty about their future. The moral dilemma that Marcus faced was unlike anything he had encountered in his business career. He had evidence of fraud and mismanagement that was diverting resources away from people who desperately needed help. But exposing the fraud would mean revealing his own identity, ending his experiment, and returning to a world where he would once again be insulated from the consequences of these failures. On the other hand, staying silent meant allowing the abuse to continue, watching as money that could change lives was instead lining the pockets of people who saw poverty as a business opportunity. The decision came to him during a conversation with Patricia Williams, who had invited him to volunteer at a weekend workshop for people who had completed her job training program. Marcus had been helping James practice interview skills when Patricia mentioned that her program was in danger of losing its funding because a larger organization had submitted a competing proposal for the same grant. "It's frustrating," Patricia said, her usual optimism dimmed by exhaustion. "We've been doing this work for 8 years, and we can show real results. People get jobs, they stay employed, they build careers, but we can't compete with organizations that have professional grant writers and fancy presentations. They promise the moon, and the funders believe them because they look more professional than we do." "What organization?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Meridian Community Development. They're proposing to expand their job training program, claiming they can serve 3 times as many people as we do with the same budget. The grant committee is impressed by their track record and their plans for growth." Patricia shook her head. "I've been in this community for 20 years, and I've never seen any evidence of their work, but their paperwork looks good, and that's what matters to the people making the decisions." That night, Marcus made his choice. He couldn't expose Meridian Community Development without revealing his own identity, but he could use his position at the insurance company to gather evidence and pass it along to someone who could act on it. He spent the weekend researching investigative journalists who specialized in non-profit fraud, looking for someone with the credibility and resources to pursue the story properly. He found what he was looking for in Sarah Chen, an investigative reporter for the local newspaper who had won awards for her coverage of government corruption and non-profit mismanagement. Marcus created an anonymous email account and sent her a carefully crafted message outlining what he had discovered about Meridian Community Development, including specific details about the empty community center, the inflated budgets, and the pattern of organizations that claimed to serve the community while providing minimal actual services. To his surprise, Sarah responded within hours, asking for more information and suggesting a meeting. Marcus agreed, but insisted on anonymity, claiming to be a concerned community member who had stumbled across evidence of fraud. They met at a coffee shop in a different neighborhood, and Marcus was struck by Sarah's intensity and professionalism as she reviewed the documents he had prepared. "This is good work," Sarah said, studying the financial records and organizational charts Marcus had compiled. "You've clearly done your homework, but I need to ask, how did you get access to some of this information? These internal budget documents, the contract details, this isn't the kind of thing that's usually available to the public." Marcus had prepared for this question. "I work in the insurance industry. Some of this came across my desk in the normal course of business. The rest I was able to piece together from public records and websites." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either, and it seemed to satisfy Sarah's concerns about his sources. "I'll need to verify all of this independently," Sarah said, "but if even half of what you're showing me is accurate, this is a significant story. How many organizations are involved?" "At least 6 that I've identified, maybe more. The total budget is probably close to $2 million a year, money that's supposed to be helping some of the most vulnerable people in the city." Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same fury he had felt when he first realized the scope of the fraud. "And you're sure about the lack of actual services?" "I've been living in this community for months. I've used every social service available, attended every program, talked to hundreds of people. The organizations that are actually helping people are struggling to keep their doors open, while these shell operations are getting rich off grant money and government contracts." Marcus's voice carried a passion that surprised even him, the intensity of someone who had seen injustice firsthand and couldn't stay silent. Sarah nodded, making notes in a reporter's notebook that looked like it had seen years of hard use. "I'll start making calls tomorrow. This kind of investigation takes time, but if the evidence supports what you're telling me, we'll expose it. And when we do, it's going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable." 3 weeks later, Sarah's investigation was published as a front-page story in the Sunday edition of the newspaper, with follow-up articles running throughout the week. The headline read, "Millions in community development funds diverted from those who need help most." And the story detailed exactly what Marcus had discovered, backed up by additional reporting and interviews with community members who confirmed that the funded programs were largely non-existent. The response was immediate and dramatic. The mayor called for an investigation. The district attorney announced that criminal charges were being considered, and several city council members demanded hearings on non-profit oversight and accountability. Most importantly, the grants that had been awarded to the fraudulent organizations were suspended, and the money was redirected to programs like Patricia's that could demonstrate actual results. Marcus watched the coverage from his studio apartment, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served. Resources were being redirected to where they could do real good, and the people responsible for the fraud would face consequences for their actions. But he also knew that his time as Mark Johnson was coming to an end. The investigation had attracted too much attention, and there was too much risk that his real identity would be discovered if he stayed in the community much longer. On his last day at the insurance office, Carol Henderson called him into her office for what she said was a routine performance review. Marcus had been dreading this moment, knowing that he would have to maintain his cover story while saying goodbye to people who had become genuinely important to him. "Mark, I have to say, you've exceeded all my expectations," Carol began, looking at a file that Marcus assumed contained his performance evaluations. "Your customer service scores are excellent. You've handled some difficult situations with real professionalism, and several clients have specifically mentioned how helpful you've been. I'm recommending you for promotion to senior associate, which comes with a raise and additional responsibilities." Marcus felt a stab of guilt, knowing that he was about to disappoint someone who had invested time and energy in his success. "Carol, I need to tell you something. I'm going to be leaving the company." "Leaving? Why? Did you get a better offer somewhere else?" Carol's surprise was genuine, and Marcus could see that she was trying to figure out what she might have done wrong. "It's not about the job or the company. You've been great, really. It's just that I have some family issues I need to deal with, and I'm going to have to move out of state." The lie felt heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge that Carol deserved better than deception from someone she had tried to help. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything we can do to help? Maybe a transfer to one of our other offices?" Carol was still trying to find a solution, still trying to help, even though she was clearly disappointed by his decision. "I appreciate that, but it's not possible. I want you to know, though, that this job, working here, it's meant more to me than you probably realize. You gave me a chance when I needed it most, and I'll never forget that." Marcus's gratitude was completely genuine, even if the circumstances were not. Carol smiled, though he could see sadness in her eyes. "Well, you've got a good reference here whenever you need one. And Mark, don't sell yourself short. You've got real potential. Whatever you do next, I know you'll be successful." That evening, Marcus packed his few belongings into the same duffel bag he had arrived with months earlier. The studio apartment that had seemed so small and shabby when he first moved in now felt like home, a place where he had learned things about himself and the world that no amount of money could have taught him. He left a note for his landlord, along with an extra month's rent, thanking him for his kindness and explaining that he had to leave suddenly for family reasons. His last stop was the community center where Patricia Williams ran her job training program. He found her in her office, grading assignments from her current class, and knocked on the open door. "Mark, what brings you by? How are things at the insurance office?" Patricia's smile was warm and genuine, the expression of someone who was always happy to see a former student succeed. "Actually, I'm leaving town. Family emergency. I wanted to stop by and thank you for everything you did for me. The program, the training, the way you believed in all of us, it made a real difference." Marcus felt emotion rising in his throat, surprised by how difficult this goodbye was. "I'm sorry you're leaving, but I'm glad the program helped. That's why we do this work, to help people like you build better lives." Patricia stood up and gave him a hug, the kind of embrace that conveyed genuine affection and support. "Keep in touch if you can. I'd like to hear how my students are doing." "I will. And Patricia, make sure you apply for that grant funding that's opening up. The community needs programs like yours." Marcus was thinking about the money that would soon be available as a result of Sarah Chen's investigation. Resources that could finally go to organizations that were actually helping people. "I heard about that. It's amazing how things work out sometimes. Just when we thought we might have to close, new opportunities appear." Patricia's optimism was infectious, her faith in the possibility of positive change unshaken by years of disappointment and struggle. Marcus left the community center and walked through the neighborhood one last time, past the corner store where he had learned to stretch $1, past the bus stop where he had waited in the rain, past the unemployment office where his journey had begun. He thought about all the people he had met, all the stories he had heard, all the small acts of kindness and resilience that had kept communities functioning despite systemic failures and institutional indifference. The next morning, Marcus Williams returned to his penthouse apartment for the first time in 4 months. The space felt enormous after his studio apartment, almost absurdly luxurious, with its marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows and view of the city spread out below. But it also felt empty, disconnected from the life he had been living, from the people whose struggles had become his own. His assistant had prepared a stack of documents that needed his attention, contracts and proposals and investment opportunities that represented millions of dollars in potential profit. But Marcus found himself thinking instead about Angela Washington's insurance claim, about James's search for work that valued his experience, about Patricia Williams's determination to help people build better lives despite inadequate resources and institutional obstacles. That afternoon, Marcus called an emergency meeting of his company's board of directors. He had prepared a presentation that would shock them, a detailed analysis of how their charitable initiatives had been failing the people they were supposed to help, how good intentions and generous funding had been subverted by organizations that saw poverty as a business opportunity rather than a problem to be solved. "What I'm about to show you," Marcus began, looking around the conference table at faces he had known for years, "will challenge everything we think we know about effective philanthropy and community development." He told them about Patricia Williams and her job training program, about the insurance office where he had learned to see customers as human beings rather than profit centers, about the daily reality of people who were trying to build better lives with inadequate resources and institutional barriers. "And the question we have to ask ourselves," Marcus concluded, "is whether we're funding charity or change. Are we writing checks to make ourselves feel better, or are we investing in solutions that actually work? Because I can tell you from personal experience that the difference matters more than we ever imagined." The silence that followed his presentation was profound, broken finally by Margaret Foster, the board's longest-serving member and its most skeptical voice. "Marcus, what you're describing is certainly concerning, but I have to ask, how do we know your experience was representative? How do we know that the programs you encountered are typical of what's happening across all our charitable initiatives?" It was a fair question, and Marcus had prepared for it. "We don't know, which is exactly the problem. We've been funding programs based on proposals and reports, rather than results and impact. We've been measuring success by dollars distributed rather than lives changed. What I'm proposing is a complete overhaul of how we approach philanthropy, starting with direct engagement with the communities we claim to serve." Over the following weeks, Marcus worked with the board to develop a new approach to charitable giving that prioritized direct service, measurable outcomes, and ongoing community engagement. They established site visit requirements, outcome-based funding models, and partnerships with grassroots organizations that could demonstrate real impact rather than just professional presentations. Most importantly, Marcus created a new position within the company, Director of Community Engagement, and offered it to Patricia Williams. When he called to make the offer, explaining that he wanted someone who understood both the challenges facing underserved communities and the practical requirements of effective programming, Patricia was initially skeptical. "Mr. Williams, I appreciate the offer, but I have to ask, why me? I don't have an MBA or experience running large-scale programs. I'm just a community college instructor who started a job training program because I saw people who needed help." Patricia's humility was genuine, but Marcus could hear the interest in her voice, the recognition that this could be an opportunity to expand her impact. "That's exactly why I want you," Marcus replied. "But you understand the difference between programs that look good on paper and programs that actually change lives. You've built something real with limited resources, and now I want to give you the resources to build something even better." 6 months later, Marcus stood in the renovated community center, where Patricia now ran an expanded job training program, funded by his foundation but designed and implemented by people who understood the community's actual needs. The space was bustling with activity. Classes in computer skills and financial literacy, workshops on interviewing and resume writing, and a small business incubator that was helping people turn their ideas into income. James was there, not as a student, but as an instructor, teaching a class on automotive repair for people who wanted to start their own service businesses. Maria had completed a management training program and was now running the center's bilingual services, helping Spanish-speaking residents navigate everything from job applications to healthcare enrollment. Angela Washington had used her insurance settlement to start a catering business and was teaching a cooking class for other aspiring entrepreneurs. "You know," Patricia said, joining Marcus as he watched the evening classes wind down, "when you first offered me this job, I thought you were just another rich guy who wanted to feel good about giving away money. I'm glad I was wrong." "What changed your mind?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "You listen. Most people in your position, they come in with solutions to problems they don't understand, programs designed by people who've never lived the struggles they're trying to address. But you actually spent time in the community, learned what people really need, figured out what works and what doesn't." Patricia paused, watching James demonstrate how to diagnose engine problems to a group of attentive students. Just that makes all the difference. Marcus nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought him here, from the unemployment office, where he had first experienced the humiliation of needing help, to this community center, where people were building better futures for themselves and their families. The experiment that had started as a way to understand his target demographic had become something much more profound, a transformation of his understanding of poverty, privilege, and the responsibility that came with both. "There's something I need to tell you," Marcus said, feeling the weight of a secret he had carried for too long. "About my time in the community, about who I really am." He had been planning this conversation for weeks, knowing that Patricia deserved the truth about the man who had become her employer and, more importantly, her friend. Patricia smiled, a knowing expression that surprised him. "You mean about the fact that you're Marcus Williams, the CEO of Meridian Industries, and not Mark Johnson, the laid-off warehouse worker?" She laughed at his shocked expression. "Marcus, I've been working in this community for 20 years. I know everyone who lives here, everyone who works here, everyone who's trying to make it here. When a man shows up with perfect teeth, expensive shoes, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having to worry about money, I notice, why didn't you say anything? Because it didn't matter who you were. What mattered was what you were doing, how you treated people, whether you were genuine in your desire to help or just playing a role." Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. And besides, I figured if you were willing to live in a studio apartment and work at an insurance office and attend job training classes just to understand what people in this community go through, then maybe you were someone worth knowing, regardless of your bank account." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment, grateful that his deception had been discovered by someone who understood his motivations, even if she disagreed with his methods. "I should have been honest from the beginning, maybe. But sometimes people need to experience things for themselves before they can really understand them. You could have written a check and felt good about yourself, but instead you chose to live the reality that most of your charitable dollars were supposed to address. That took courage, even if it also took deception." Patricia looked around the bustling community center at the lives being changed and the futures being built, and look what came of it. Real programs, real help, real change. Sometimes the ends do justify the means. That evening, Marcus drove home through the city he thought he had known, seeing it now with eyes that had been opened by months of living on its margins. He passed the neighborhoods where he had learned to navigate bureaucracy and budget groceries, where he had discovered that poverty was not a character flaw, but a systemic problem that trapped good people in bad circumstances. He thought about all the assumptions he had made, all the judgments he had passed, all the ways he had failed to see the humanity in people whose struggles he had never shared. The transformation that had begun in an unemployment office with a fake identity had become something much more profound, a recognition that privilege carried responsibility, that wealth was meaningless without purpose, that the most important investments were not in stocks or bonds, but in the potential of human beings who had been written off by a society that measured worth in dollars rather than dignity. If this story has opened your eyes to the invisible struggles happening in your own community, if it's made you question your own assumptions about poverty and privilege, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere in your city, there's a Patricia Williams running a program that changes lives, a James teaching skills that matter, an Angela building a business that serves her community. The question isn't whether these people exist, but whether we have the courage to see them, support them, and learn from them. Real change doesn't happen when we write checks from a distance. It happens when we show up, listen deeply, and recognize that everyone deserves not just charity, but opportunity, dignity, and hope.